be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So imagine being a worker who's ready to go to another day of work. You know, your union is there, it's providing for you, it's providing you the benefits that you need, it's helping you with your hours and your time and your money and everything. And then you realize you're in an economic crisis, and boom, the business that for which you work for is now facing facing lots of failures due to the fact that we're in an economic crisis. And turns out you are fired the next day. With that being said, I will be dividing my speech into four key pieces of framing. I'll be mentioning my policy, and I'll be mentioning my 2 arguments relating to this. Now, regarding framing, I'll be mentioning what exactly is a trade union. So that is the organization of workers that ensures its protection, and labor laws are these aspects of are the laws that manage the aspects of the employment of these workers, which includes their working conditions, their wages, their safety, and the discrimination that they may face. And along with that, there's also suspension, which refers to the temporary stopping of these minimum, for example, things such as the minimum wage laws in times of economic crises, so that businesses can stay afloat. Now, with that being said, here's the key thing that we should be asking, what exactly is an economic crisis? This refers to things such as hyperinflation, things such as the job market crashing, and and periods of high unemployment and increased poverty and instability within the economy. With that, how does this affect businesses? This leads to, for example, less people buying due to inflation. These people have less buying power, and with that being said, they have less incentive to go out and spend in these different businesses because they can't buy anymore. And along with that, this also causes businesses to have a lower ability to sell because the materials that they need, the capital, there's not enough to be spent, and with that being said, they can't properly manufacture the products that they want to make. Now, with that being said, we need to keep in mind that our policy is just a temporary suspension. It will only be working in times of economic crisis, as mentioned before, and we will unsuspend them when inflation rates adjust, when the stock market revives, and the economy is overall in a way better state. And along with that, not yet. Along with that, we will not be suspending laws that relate to, for example, the human rights of workers, because essentially we still need to ensure the safety and the ability for these workers to work as best as we can, which is why we won't be suspending laws relating to things such as sexual abuse or exploitation from workers. We will only be suspending the laws that have to do with the economic side, the business aspects. Yes, I'll be paying.
Is the speaker aware that human protection rights, for example, like sexual abuse, exploitation, those are part of labor human protection laws? So how can you say that it's not part of it when they have always been a part of labor protection laws in the first place?
Yes, they are part of the labor laws, but our policy involves only suspending those that relate to the economics aspect, as I just mentioned. It's not, we'll be emphasizing suspending the laws that have to do with economics, the things that have to do with the spending and saving and money management of the businesses. Now, with that being said, here are the 2 key arguments. Number 1 is that unions actually directly disadvantage businesses during times of economic crisis. Essentially, what we're saying here is that unions are making things worse in these crises by being selfish. Everyone is trying to survive. You, your employer, everyone is trying to survive. And by focusing on on these things such as like better pay, better time management, things such as that, you essentially detract from what you could be doing for the businesses. These times, businesses need to maximize productivity from their workers, and it is in these times that they really should not be focusing on things such as the benefits for workers, because everyone is trying to survive. Why are you trying to focus on these extra things when you should be focused on trying to making it through the day, for example, if you're the worker? So with that being said, I'll be taking that later. And along with that, we need to ensure that because everyone is hurt, okay, this actually trickles down to both the union workers and the non-union workers. In regards to the long-term effects, for example, in the short term, unions are forced to essentially cave in to the demands of their workers. They are trying to manage their hours, they're trying to cut costs, and because these businesses are trying to survive, essentially, or because these businesses are trying to survive, and by focusing their energy and their time and effort into providing for these workers, they're essentially setting themselves up for failure because they do not focus, they do not properly allocate in times of need, such as these economic crisis. And as a result, both the union workers and the non-union workers fail, which actually leads to my second point, which is that it harms everyone involved. Along with, which means that there's actually this increased chance of layoffs because the businesses are trying to cut costs, and because they're trying to cut costs, they're going to try cutting the wages necessary, and as a result, laying off more people to save money. This actually causes flooding in the job market, let's say, because everyone will be trying to get a new job. And when this happens, okay, they end up both the non-union and union workers end up competing with each other because they end up trying to survive. And in this fight for survival, because of union labor laws, they cannot fully. It truly does not benefit them for all those reasons.
Thanks for your speech. Leader of Up.
This is the position, right? Just one. I would like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, what proposition brings up in this debate might seem true in the short run. Proposition tries to tell you that if these workers or if this policy is not adopted, what's going to happen is workers are basically going to get fired and they're going to have nothing, because at least they're basically saying that they're going to provide something to these workers, but on our side of the house, they're going to provide nothing. That is the major cause that we hear from Tree Proposition as a whole. And I, as opposition's first speaker, will be proving to you why their stance and their model fails. Before moving on to our side of the house, we would like to first touch on the model that they have talked about. The key thing to notice in this model is how they talk about temporary suspension. They told us to when these economic crises are over with, which they don't tell how to judge this economic crisis are over. Even if we assume that they are able to judge when these economic crises are over or solved, they don't really tell us as to who will restore these temporary suspensions. Because firstly, even if we do assume that the government itself are able to remove these temporary suspensions are able to apply these suspensions in the first place, they still fail to explain as to who are going to bring about these temporary suspensions or restore these suspensions back to the thing once the economic crisis is over. That's the main thing missing on their model. Secondly, they talk about how unions itself are selfish and how they are talked about how survival is key in status quo. But this is inherently flawed because survival being key is the same reason that why we also advocate. We believe that survival being key is more important to these workers rather than the top business people who are anyways going to survive no matter what, right? And what are the point of the labor protection laws? To protect the people when they are at their most vulnerable, which are during the times of economic crisis, which is something completely ignored by team opposition. Moving on to the third major point I would like to talk about is about increased chance of layoff, right? And how, but two main things. Firstly, they talk about how businesses want to increase productivity, but they don't really, but this point directly contradicts this. If a business wants to increase productivity, why would they involve in layoffs, right? So they don't really answer this question on their side of the house. But even if we do by what they say, we still win out in this debate due to our counter model. Moving on, what is the counter model instead? Before that, I would like to clarify the stance, right? The stance of opposition is that we do not justify abandoning fundamental protections and removing or suspending trade unions and labor protection laws, even if we do assume that it's going to be restored after this economic crisis, which is proposition's burden to prove in this debate, which they have not done, right? Secondly, we believe that these unions are not actually obstacles to economic recovery, but we believe that they are the sole foundation that this recovery takes place, right? Firstly, the contextualization. Why does this exist? Because the purpose of crisis response is not to just get rid of temporary shocks, but policy should preserve long-term stability. We tell you that when this labor protection laws do exist on our side of the house, we promote long-term stability, as these workers themselves will have something to rely upon. These trade unions itself, they know that even though these economic crises occurs, they will be in a position of, at least a position where their fundamental rights are protected, right? Secondly, the point about stabilizers, they prevent, yes?
Don't you think it's more likely that these businesses have to fail because they end up conforming to the demands of the unions and thus they lose all of the money and then therefore they end up failing and unions end up losing
Okay.
jobs in the first place?
Thank you for the question. This is something I would elaborate in my counter model. I promise I'll do it. Second point is about stabilizers. Yeah, they prevent exploitation, ensuring negotiations and maintain morale. They remove the foundation. What proposition aims is to remove the foundation, which is when we need it the most. We need something to support the most vulnerable in the case of an earthquake. We can't remove the foundation when an earthquake occurs, right? This is what proposition is inherently arguing for, right? Moving on to the counter model in this debate, which is something I promised them. The counter model in this debate is about, we believe that these businesses should enter into a negotiation with these trade unions rather than completely suspending them, these labor protection laws. What's the incentive of these businesses to enter into a, let's say, like a sort of like a compromise? Why? Because like they themselves have pointed out, businesses do not want to shut down. They want to maintain this. But they know that suspending trade unions, if it's not possible, what do they want to do? They have an incentive to bring up a compromise with these trade unions so that they protect the fundamental. What do we achieve by this model? We achieve something better than them. We promote fundamental laws. We ensure that the basic level of fundamental is reached, right? So we are not saying that we do address that economic situation is dire, but we believe that suspending these are not the right solution, and the businesses themselves have an incentive to actually compromise with these people. This is the counter model, and it applies more than their side. Because they don't really elaborate as to what this temporary suspension looks like and who implements these particular suspensions and how do you make sure that these suspensions, so you don't get any practical thing. But we tell you that this sort of compromise will occur because these businesses have an incentive to continue and make profits, right? But moving on to the first major argument, even if we do believe what proposition says is true and we do believe that economic crisis does exist and it is dire, we tell you this main argument that it hurts recovery by social unrest. Investors actually require stable economy for these businesses to. No investor is going to apply into an economy where they know that this business itself is going to fail. We are in an economic crisis here. But even if we do buy what they say, and even if they say that even if they say what they say is true, we still win because we provide you a situation where there's minimal source of social unrest. Because in these dire situations are the places where you need to provide the most protection to these people, right? Which is essentially they concede to the fact that we provide you a better moral situation, right? The impact of this is as follows: we essentially achieve what proposition says, but in a way where we include both A, the trade unions, B, the workers, and C, the business leaders, for example, right? Moving on to the second major argument of my speech is about why they promote long-term instability or they invalidate the point of rights. Like we again and again pushing. The principle of framing on our side of the house is that we believe that the entire point of rights is to protect people when they most need it, right? You don't want your rights when you're already in a simple and a perfect situation. You want your rights when you know you're going to be abused. And that point only comes in terms of an economic crisis, which is something that proposition can't contend with and have to concede to in this debate. Secondly, the second major reason is that they reduce workers' buying power, right? Which is something that we already proved to you why layoffs are not going to happen. But rights, again, the thing is, they reduce workers' buying power, and what this happens is they completely ignore the long-term instability caused by them, right? Because that is why we believe that this argument still stands. The impact of this is again that we promote you a situation wherein even after these economic crises, we don't need a sort of recovery period. Because, for example, after the 2022 pandemic, countries like North Korea really suffered to get back from this. Why? Because they weren't able to push this sort of temporary suspensions back to restoration. It took over 3 years. With this, never been more proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. I would now like to invite the second speaker from the government.
I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest exploitation on side opposition is when people are put out of jobs by a business that has been forced to lay them off by the demands of unions that have shackled their economic capital. The biggest exploitation is when people without unions are oppressed by these selfish unions who only consider their own interests and therefore have shackled their businesses out of getting them jobs, giving them any kind of investment, any kind of relief. Because when opposition fights for rights, they do so at the expense of everyone else, and that is why we tell you on government, we must fight for these people equally for the broader economy in the long term, not just a fancy set of people who are able to be protected on their side of the house. 3 things in this speech. I'm going to tell you exactly first how we're going to benefit first businesses, second the non-unionized people. And thirdly, I'm going to flip their entire arguments and explain to you how those who are unionized actually get hurt under their policy in the long term. I first want to get onto some quick points of rebuttal here. The first major push from opening opposition is that we're going to have these negotiations between businesses and the unions in order to get the maximal output. I want to point out that even if our model is simplified, theirs is even more simplified. They tell you that negotiations are going to happen, but I don't think that these negotiations are actually going to help in the long term because of the fact that these businesses and unions exist because of the conflicting interests of business administrations and these labor protection laws. Therefore, you're not going to get any kind of substantial negotiation. Their entire case relies on some sort of magical point of these people agreeing with each other when it is more likely that you're not going to get any kind of compromise on their side of the house. We tell you on government, we took a harder stance. We told you that these people needed to be protected in the long term by having a suspension. Secondly, they told us, no thank you, that these rights were going to be important. Like guys, the biggest exploitation of people's rights is when they end up getting unemployed, laid off from these jobs, because in order to satisfy the economic capital that these businesses are suffering from as a result of the economic crisis, instead of doing things like paying lower wages and stripping some benefits temporarily, they end up laying off people. They end up having to detract investors and raise prices. You know what those things actually harm? They harm the buyers in the large majority of cases. They harm the people who these unions are supposed to protect because the businesses cannot cater to their asinine demands. We tell you that if you're worried about these people's rights, the larger exploitation of their rights is when they are forcibly laid off by the fact that these jobs inherently cannot survive, that the company does not have enough money to pay them what the unions demand. First idea then, no thank you, on why these unions end up worsening these laws end up worsening the long-term economic survival of businesses then. I want to talk about two layers here. First point here is that there are short-term drawbacks, as we told you in OG, that we were very happy to have if it meant that these people could survive in the long term. That inherently, we as a worker would prefer to be paid less, or prefer to be having less benefits than to be out of a job as would be the likely thing on their side of the house. Why? Because these businesses inherently do not have the capital as a result of the economic crisis that they have to survive, and therefore the workers and their jobs themselves are dependent on them having less union laws, less strict labor protections, because these are the things that actually matter to these businesses to actually keep their workers afloat. But secondly, this is not the extreme kind of characterization that CO tries to paint. The idea here is that we literally told your Prime Minister that we would only take away the economic protections, that we can still have these kinds of sexual protection laws and anti-harassment things, but in these cases, we would still only prioritize the massive economic policies that would help these workers, that would maybe lower their wages, would be much more preferable to having them lose a job and thus have less lower investments. But secondly, the idea here that productivity ends up worsening, no thank you, because of the fact that investors are scared to invest in a business that has low economic capital, that if they cannot manage their cash flow because they are paying too much to their workers, as what these unions have said, that investors are scared, even more scared, to actually invest in these businesses and thus make them survive in the long term. I want to know that in order for these businesses to survive post-economic crisis, in order to have a good ROI, they need investors to be confident. They can't just have their money slowly dissipating because of the fact that these unions demand higher minimum wage, because they demand higher benefits and things like this. We fundamentally must cut the line there, because in order to survive in the long term, they must manage their cash flow more effectively, not throw it all away when they're already suffering because of what these unions demand. Yes.
Firstly, can the speaker talk about what temporary suspensions look like? And secondly, even if layoffs do exist, we tell you that layoffs themselves are particular labor protection laws. You can't just fire people out of the blue. That's actually a law in and itself.
Yes, sir. The point is that you must use layoffs because of the fact that you cannot cut costs in other ways. That was the comparative we gave you. You never actually mentioned that on their side of the house. And as for temporary suspensions, yes, I would say that these are very, very clear, like the government is going to restore them after the fact. And your side of the house actually has a worse counter model. You literally never explained to us how your negotiations are going to result in any kind of fruition on your side of the house. But secondly, non-unionized people end up suffering, because the idea here is that if you are forced to use these layoffs, if you're forced to use worse benefits, these people who end up in unions actually ironically get laid off and put out of these jobs because the company must save costs on their side of the house. And this means those without unions, those who are not protected, are thus competing with them in the job market when everyone else is suffering. That is to say that these people equally end up suffering as a result of what these unions request. Because these unions end up strangling the company and forcing them to pay them more, they end up getting laid off instead and competing for jobs with other people in the market who are not unionized, who are not protected. These are the kinds of vulnerable the people that OG stands for, not the unionized people who can sit cushy during the economic crisis, but these are people who need to survive. I want to point out that these people in the unions and both in the non-unions rely on the business. That if their business fails as a result of these massive demands of the union, that's gonna drain their capital, and thus in the long term, the business can't survive anyway. So if they're really worried about the people on their side of the house, they have to tell us why the business is not going to survive, why this will not fail on their side of the house when you have these unions. In times of economic crisis, we cannot have these people choking these businesses at the helm. Therefore, you only vote for OG.
I'll start in 3, 2, 1. If rights and laws are suspended wherever convenient, then they are no longer rights or laws. Okay, let's talk about team proposition's entire case, right? Which revolved around one major thing, that layoffs will happen. Two main responses to that, okay? We tell you it won't happen because number one, layoffs in themselves are covered by labor protection laws, and number two, let's assume that the companies come to an extent where they cannot do anything whatsoever. They hire more workers to ensure that they have more output, to ensure that they survive in a very bad economic situation. Secondly, their whole point about layoffs is contradicting their first speaker's stance, where she herself mentions that there are alternative ways to ensure that layoffs and economic instability do not actually occur in this context of a company, in the sense that they would reduce the amount of laws that they would limit, thereby ensuring that there is less economic layoff, right? And then the second speaker comes up and tells us that there is no other way to reduce any kind of burden on the company, and that there is no other way except a basic conclusion that companies will do a layoff. Okay, which is again a contradiction of their own case. Alright, talking about the first major argument, which is about suspending laws related to economic aspects, they mention how some laws are going to be suspended. Well, number one, that is flawed because A, you cannot ensure that only some laws are suspended because these laws apply to the labor in itself, and you cannot imagine that once you suspend only like 2 laws, there's going to be no impact whatsoever. And number two, they tell us that they want to fight for a broader economy. Number one, panel, economy is the people. If you're fighting for a broader economy, you fight for the people, which is why my side tells you how. First major argument on my side is number one, we protect workers. Okay, let's now imagine the situation, yeah? Your economy is already low, okay? And your workers are fired and not given any money, right? Now, what happens in this case is when we stabilize economy in the way of trade unions and labor protection laws, we ensure that we stabilize consumption in the sense that if people are fired, they're not going to be allowed to purchase things. And when you don't purchase things, you don't give money to the government. And when you don't give money to the government, you don't ensure a cycle of consumption that will, again, in the long run, help the economy. Number two is, okay, income stability is so important in this state because it ensures that people actually have some sort of understanding of the government and what's happening, and it ensures that they have the capacity to stay updated on certain things. Alright, why does this happen? Let me give you an example, right? In Germany, for the Kurzarbeit thing, which by the way, they also ensured labor protection laws in the sense that they reduced the amount of hours, ensuring that they could not go through a layoff as team opposition mentions throughout their case. What this did was Germany recovered faster than the entire European Union, and businesses stayed intact. Second major argument, right? Exploitation exists. What this basically means is companies are selfish, right? So when you temporarily abuse the rights of these people, you abuse these rights in a way that it could be very, very likely that in the long term, these rights could be violated again and again and again. Yes, I'll take your point.
Your bench needs to give us a comparative. Literally, how are the businesses gonna replenish their profits when the higher wages that the unions demand drain their cash flow?
Okay, as I said earlier, right? When you give people money, you give them the assurance of buying things that they need. What this does is it creates a cycle of it basically gives them the businesses and the government money as opposed to no one doing anything and just constantly laying off people as mentioned by them. Alright, now talking about again exploitation, an example of this would be the COVID-19 lockdowns and the 2008 economic instability crisis in Germany in itself. Not Germany, sorry, some other place. So what this basically did was, this was a temporary thing, yeah? But in the long run, we still see that there are companies and that there are countries where this happened, where so much, and there was a lot of economic instability because of this main reason, because companies tend to exploit temporary layoffs or whatever they really mention in the long run to again happen to be more profitable in the long run. Now why does this happen? Because companies are again selfish and they want to maximize profit. But who suffers in the long run? The people. And who suffers in the long run? The economy. So in our side of the house, we tell you that in our best case, short term, we would maybe suspend short term thank you. We would suspend short term benefit by a little margin, as I said, as my first speaker mentioned, a little bit of decreased working margins, but we would ensure that there would be a better long-term impact in the sense that workers are more likely to actually be more diligent and more hardworking and ensure that the economy actually is restored. In their best case, we assume that magically something is going to happen which ensures that workers have some sort of rights being violated and the others are apparently not, and that this will actually work in the scenario. In their case, in their worst case, this won't basically happen, and in our worst cases, even if our analysis does not work, we ensure that in the long term, it is crucial in ensuring a better economy and a more stable economy. Panel, we tell you that you cannot cut costs in other ways in their other side, which they by the way mentioned in their first speaker speech. We tell you that their whole case is based on a bunch of random assumptions and no real impact, and they only doubt us by not giving us proper reasoning to their assertions. They mention how we have selfish companies that show their own interests, but they don't mention how these companies show their own interests and basically, fire these workers. And that's why we are so proud to propose. Oppose, sorry.
Member of Parliament.
Can I get 10 seconds?
Alright, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, in crisis, survival precedes structure. The motion doesn't talk about crushing rights, it rather talks about saving the people and the system which sustains them. We suspend, not abolish, because in case of economic paralysis, all of us end up in trouble, and the ones who are in the worst are the workers. Let's look at the 2008 Greece example, right? Their over-regulation led to deepened economic crisis, deepened unemployment, just ending up worsening the situation. Notice how over-regulation was the case. That is why we proudly propose the motion to suspend trade unions and labor protection laws in times of economic crisis. 3 major things in my speech. Firstly, I'll be presenting some rebuttals, then I'll be adding in our reformed model, then I'll be moving on to our arguments. So, notice how opposition brought up like rights are suspended whenever convenient. Well, panel, we've stated explicitly that rights are suspended only in cases of economic crisis. I would like to add on to the definition of economic crisis, like few instances clearly define economic crisis, so you can't really call it random, because crisis could be considered when the unemployment rate increases from 10%, right? That's just one example. Secondly, they also brought up about how companies could hire more labor to do more work so that they stabilize the overall conditions, right? Notice how this doesn't seem to fit in at all, because once the company is already in crisis and it's struggling with existing workers, the scope of bringing in more workers is really superficial, and it's totally not impossible. Thirdly, they talk about income stability and exploitation, right? Well, panel, exploitation is far worse on their side. On our side, even if exploitation occurs, it's bound to come up openly to the public because of some reforms we will suggest. But in their case, with the existing laws, companies will be over pressurized. Companies could go to unimaginable extents to exploit the workers and try to cover it up without any government intervention, right? No, thank you. Now, here's the model we suggest, right? We suggest that the government officially declares when crisis starts, and with the start of the crisis, the laws temporarily get suspended, and the labor protection, the trade unions too. But what comes in play? There is a crisis council, which isn't made up of workers only, right? There's the government, there's the employer, there's the workers involved together who come up with solutions as and when required to here. The disadvantage of trade unions is still there, as in the disadvantage is sometimes the workers who are older or the more influential workers tend to benefit rather than all the workers, right? In this scenario, there could be equal representation. There will be the government involved intervening into the company's actions in exchange of the laws being suspended. This way, the government directly can, no thank you, can ensure what's going wrong, and they can be the supreme judge here to ensure everything works fine, even though there's no laws protecting, right? Secondly, after that, there could be, when there's temporary law suspension, there's obviously the civil society and the NGOs which could come in handy to protect and to come and support. No, thank you. There could be funds coming up, or the government or international funds coming up, which could provide basic life requirements to these workers, right? There could be homes being provided. There could be rent being covered by the government when these workers are in a terrible situation, right? So gradually this goes on until the government calls off the economic crisis, wherein the laws are again imposed for a yet safe labor group, right? So the stakeholders are already well described by our opening slide. Now, let's look at this panel. The economic crises aren't usually felt by one or two companies alone, right? It's a national interest. And in case of national interest, individual rights can be left behind to some extent. They're not being, they're not being left behind or abolished, right? I stress again that they're just being suspended for some time. Government has this obligation because it has to ensure the workers remain to be protected by the rights after all. Imagine we take up that case, right? We don't suspend the labor laws. We force the companies to continue paying the workers as it is, right? In the end, the companies may go bankrupt. There could be companies collapsing on a whole. After that, there's more unemployment, right? And no, thank you. Notice these labor laws don't protect the minor labor. They don't only guarantee the wages or salaries for the smaller workers only, right? There are the well-paid workers too. They're like the higher class too. So what could be done right now is the wages of the higher paid workers could be cut off to substitute for the reformation of the low paid workers, so that there's uniformity, so that everyone has their share. No, thank you. Everyone's able to sustain until they can. Now, secondly, there's also the potential of extension because, no thank you, company is suspending, but the company could suspend some workers for some time where the government is taking them up to protect them, and the companies could focus on the core staff to reduce the overall fall of the company. The impact would be that the company tries to sustain itself with the best staff it has. In the end, it can take up the company, the workers previously suspended later on, so that they all sustain gradually, right? The spirit of national unity and strength is really important in this case. Let's look at my extended argument about how survival architecture goes from confrontation to coordination, right? Outcome isn't about just right versus survival, right? It's right via survival. We have to survive, and survival is better guaranteed on our side because of the suspension and because of the alternatives. Secondly, we're stopping the shadowing of the workers, right? Otherwise, on their case, workers tend to seem happy. Their future is actually in question though. The workers don't have a proper future. In our case, it might seem like there's a storm, there's chaos. In our case, it's controlled chaos. We know what we're doing. We're stopping the workers' rights for some time, just for the better future of them. So as an impact, we have a better civil society. We have more uniformity. We're taking control of the situation rather than escalating it further. With that, I would request the jury to let the motion stand.
Can I just have a 10-second to prepare my notes? If that's okay. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2. I'm completely disappointed in this debate because no team here actually knows why an economic crisis happens, and no one from all these teams actually know what do trade unions and labor protection laws actually do. Three things. One, I'm going to be doing some reframing of the motion. Second, I'll be doing some refutations, and then I'll be giving on towards some positive extensions on why opposition's case remains superior. Now let's move on to the reframing, right? Why do economic crisis happens in the first place, panel? Because why the economic crisis happens is it's not because there's like a massive unemployment or layoffs. No, it happens when there is less supply, there's less demand, which overall lessens productivity, and then it also lessens the purchasing power. And when is purchasing power lessened? It is lessened when workers aren't able to actually afford the basic necessities they actually need. So what is the purpose of these trade unions and labor protection laws actually do? What is their purpose? Their purpose is to be a checks and balances. They don't have a superior authority to any of these private companies. No, their whole authority is to have the bargaining power to negotiate. To negotiate for what? More salaries, for more protection, to protect the rights of these workers, towards a reasonable amount or to a reasonable price. Not necessarily that they are inherently selfish and in which they'll be imposing all these protection laws or increased salaries. No, it always goes throughout a negotiation between the private companies, the government, and the trade unions itself. And why is this the case? Because there is an incentive for workers to work more efficiently, because if they don't work, then these trade unions and protection laws being suspended will only actually naturally lessen their salary, because salaries are only lessened when the company isn't able to provide. But when you suspend these trade unions and labor protection laws, salaries are only lessened because the company wants to boost productivity, which is inherently wrong, right? No, thank you. So the entire case of government bench is the idea that by being able to suspend these trade protection laws and trade unions, we're able to actually revive the economy by boosting businesses and to ensure that the economy is ultimately revived, and which increases productivity and lessens layoffs. Now, why is this completely wrong? It's because of the idea of trickle-down economics. Let's take the French private companies, for example. They went to Africa, they privatized companies there, they suspended trade protection laws and trade unions, and overall they were able to boost the economic GDP by a lot. They were able to lift Africa from an economic crisis. But what happened after? What happens is, even though you get a stable economy, you actually it actually led to even more layoffs of these workers. Most of these workers don't get the economic money or the economic benefit that they're supposed to receive. Hence why Africa is still one of the most poorest countries despite being one of the most economic growing countries. Because most of these economic gain, these economic benefits only trickle down to these private companies who remain in power and take control of the cash flow in checks. Which is why government's case, in which by being able to revive the economy and being able to provide a better future for these workers, doesn't actually happen, because trickle-down economics just doesn't necessarily work like that. So now I'll be giving
information.
Sure.
If you're worried about people being unable to afford goods and services, tell us how else businesses save costs, because otherwise they have to lay off people, and thus they cannot buy these things anyway if you're laid off.
Okay, I get it. I'll be going into that for a second. So now I'd like to be giving on some positive extensions, right? Because the whole point of government's bench is the idea of consequentialism, right? Which means it doesn't matter how harmful or good the means are, for as long as the ends justifies it. But politically, this is simply just wrong, as it violates the ILO international law. Because even if this suspension is temporarily, politically it's going to be much more difficult to restore them. Because what's the best case scenario? Sure, by temporarily suspending them, it ends up lifting the economy and companies are able to do better. So what's the incentive for companies to then restore those labor protection laws and trade unions when they know they're already doing much better off without them? So that only makes it even more difficult for the workers to actually earn their rights. Secondly, it only normalizes exploitation under the disguise of crisis management, because at the end of the day, companies are going to do anything. They're going to use any means of what they want, for as long as it builds the companies, as long as CEOs are going to get more money out of it, which is why they're more likely to exploit their workers when there aren't any labor protection laws. So what does that lead to? company inefficiency. Because the only way you lead yourself out of an economic crisis is when a company becomes more productive. How does a company become more productive? It's when its workers have an actual driving incentive to actually work for its company, to actually have a better means of production and goods. And that only happens when these workers have an incentive. And what is that incentive? Which is simply the idea of being able to get higher salaries, a company's prosperity, and overall just having a company that actually cares and protects them, which is simply undermined in their world. So by these fear-driven regulations only breeds permanent inequality because it becomes the corporate norm and reduces purchasing power. You can see this completely in like OFWs in the Middle East or the the French colonization in Africa. So here are a few positive extensions. Historically, the only reason why many strong labor unions were able to lift themselves out of economic crisis was one thing. The idea of having trade unions working together with private companies to actually solve the economic issues. So that's the reason why the European Union exists in the first place, because many labor unions, many private companies from all sorts of Europe were able to come together, work collaboratively, and because of that, they were able to actually work for a better economic prosperity that actually benefited the whole entirety of Europe rather than one company in itself. Politically, suspending rights leads to only an authoritarian precedent where companies are, because when you suspend these trade protection laws and trade unions, you end up suspending checks and balances, which means there is no entity that actually puts these private companies in place. Oh, is it 6 minutes? Okay, with all these reasons is the main reason why you should side with team opposition, because we would rather choose a world where workers aren't simply exploited for the sake of economic benefit which doesn't trickle down to the poor people. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Government whip, whenever ready.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. And panel labor laws with any labors is only ineffective as much as opposition's entire model in today's debate. I'll be doing two major things in today's debate. Firstly, clarification rebuttals, and secondly, clash in today's debate. The clash of what we heard in today's debate. First of all, what have we really heard from the opposition benches? They go on and on, talking about how workers are more exploited in the case of suspended trade unions, etc. Right? Panel, two major responses. Firstly, we tell you that because of the very virtue of a framework, we tell you due to this public oversight and overall help of NGOs and other global actors, we see there's going to be increased limelight, increased review, and increased accountability on corporate organizations. Right? We tell you in Answer the House, because of this very structure, we see there's going to be only increased accountability, meaning that there's not going to be much loophole or much ground for any mishaps to take place in the first place. Secondly, we tell you that there's not going to be this blatant violation. Why? Because we tell you these corporations, even if they're selfish, we tell you they still would care about their PR and would not want to have a bad PR or go through any legal ensuitment. Right? We tell you even for selfish reasons, these companies would not blatantly exploit and would have a restriction on as to what they're doing or as to what they're carrying out in status quo itself. Right? Secondly, they talk about how businesses should compromise with trade unions and should come to discourse and discussions. And firstly, by the very nature, trade unions and corporates are always loggerheads with each other, right? Meaning that from the founding principles, they're always in complete opposition with each other. The very power to get them in the same room, to organize them together and go through this entire process of discourse will only result in more chaos. In Answer the House, we limit this chaos, especially during these troubled times. Moving into my first major clash on practicality, that is which house looks after economic development and stability. Panel, we tell you by suspending trade unions, we are essentially easing economic pressure in government institutions, right? We tell you because of framework and because of our
because of the virtue of framework, in our side of the house, we only see there's going to be more spending expenditure, more spending capabilities by the government, where they can use this money to distribute among the people, among the poor, among the more needy, right? In our side of the house, we tell you one fundamental principle that collective sacrifice is far more collective sacrifice is part of collective survival, right? We tell you that governments have this basic incentive to look after its people, hence it will take any means necessary. And we tell you, through these means, people are still having a job, people are still being employed. More on this later. We tell you because of strict labor and unflexible labor laws, strikes and other recessions only slow down recovery. We tell you that during these all hands on deck situation, it calls for reduction on non-essential sectors. That looks like suspending. This looks like prevention of. This looks like suspending firing restrictions, meaning that the core staff is retained and reassigned, and that is to say, this employee base is always preserved. Moving on to my second major clash based on principle. Panel, we tell you from time and time again, government has this obligation to look after the greater majority of its people, right? That is to say, governments will take any means necessary to take care of each and every people, right? By having a better resource pool, they can spend this money on the more needy sectors, or much money on the poor, or on the more marginalized sectors in society. I'll be taking one POI.
Okay, so let's say the economy was able to revive. How does this trickle down to the poor, and what's the incentive for companies to bring back trade unions in labor protection laws if they feel like it's much better for them if they don't have it? So how does this trickle down to the poor?
Okay, so panel again, when economies do stabilize, all these corporations will be functioning back to its fully fledged state, meaning that they would be driven to this incentive of regaining or re-employing more people, right? So we again see there's going to be only more employment and more financial benefits that's going out to people, meaning that we see that overall in a net scale, we see that people all throughout the country will be having increased employment and increased payment as a whole. Moving on to my principal clash, we tell you how in our side of the house, our extension on strengthen national unity clearly redefines a very trajectory where we pull away not only from the basic financial aspect but rather about the national identity. We tell you when governments, employees unite as one, we essentially set forward a good global precedent, inviting global investors and setting forward a good moral and positive limelight. So in our side of the house, we only see there's going to be strengthened global ties, strengthened global recognition, and overall inviting more international trade benefits and beneficiaries taking place in our side of the house. Moving on to our enhanced model. In our model, we clearly and concisely talk about who is the party taking care of the affair, and we tell you that this model is triggered only when we meet a certain limitation factor, such as, let's say, the GDP goes down by 15%, or the unemployment rate increases by so and so percent, right? We tell you that government NGOs altogether and global actors form this independent body that helps monitor how these restrictions are to be carried out in status quo. Right? We tell you that this model is provisionary and is only temporary and does not suppress any of the basic human rights, but rather only bends the economic and financial rights of employees as a whole. With this, I will be ending my speech and urge the jury to side with our bench.
Guys, can I get your speaker order?
Akhilesh first, Mukunth second. Is it just me or is it kind of hot here?
Yeah.
I think it's the debates.
Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Imagine the collapse of Wall Street, the silencing of the civil rights movement, and apartheid being perpetuated. That is an outcome of government world where social capital is not prioritized alongside financial capital. As the opposition whip, I'll tell you everything as to why our case stands and why theirs doesn't. Well, I'll begin this by saying that the opening government has stated that unions are being selfish in the times of economic crisis, and they say this as it requests for better conditions, and it strays away from this main focus of actually trying to improve the economy. And this is not the case considering that labor unions can actually help these businesses improve the economy, and it does not have to dichotomize both of their roles in this kind of situation. Why is that the case? Well, because when you are not suspending them, it allows to democratize the economy and collaborate between both parties by essentially allowing these labor unions to let these workers work more productively and more motivated to fix the economy, unlike what is stated on the government side. What they are trying to give us is this kind of model wherein we are telling these workers to work work for more hours, to work for more times and more effort without actually receiving what the just compensation that they need. And so essentially, this does not give them the incentive to actually work as, in a much more broader sense as to actually contribute and actually provide a better solution as to the situation at hand. And thus, in our side, actually, both work towards the same model towards the same goal of actually improving the economic status and actually getting towards this status of being in stability. Considering the points that have been mentioned by the opening opposition and what have been given by my previous speaker. And thus, I would like to say that what has been stated in their side, when we are suspended, we get this double negative outcome wherein there is less transparency within these companies because they are giving this kind of suspension towards these workers by laying them off, by giving them these conditions, and it also allows to stay in this crisis considering that you are not giving them the incentive to actually work towards that role. And so I would like to substantiate by saying that they also said how trade unions cause these layoffs by i.e. firing, and because businesses would want to increase productivity. And this is not the case considering that layoffs happen more on their world, considering that they are suspending trade unions and reducing their buying power as stated by my previous speaker, and so they lower their wages. And I would like to add on to this by how, I'll take you a bit, about how the DPM on their side says that investors would not find it attractive to invest in a company with low financial capital, but also I would like to add that low worker rights and conditions will actually make it not attractive for these investors to invest in those companies, and thus it would still be a net negative for their side, yes.
Would you think transparency would be better on our side because we're exchanging labor rights in place of government intervention into the companies in the form of unions, where government is coming up with the workers and the employers?
That would not be the case considering that you're suspending these trade unions and actually allowing them to give this platform to actually express their side as the workers. Because yet again, you are not giving this incentive for them to actually work towards the goal of actually providing stability into the economy. And so, as stated, they also added to this fact about how they raised on such a point that flexibility saves businesses and jobs, and how rigid labor laws are hard to adapt for companies, and thus flexibility is needed to cut costs and to restructure, to temporarily lower wages and thus avoid closure. And what I would like to say to this is what happens here is how we cut wages, we overwork employees and actually unfairly fire them, and thus this worsens this state of poverty and inequality as given. And how is that the case? Well, it's because economic recovery that relies on suffering is not sustainable, considering that strong labor rights equates or allows to actually provide consumer confidence and spending, and how a case of this actually happened in Sweden in 2008, which was, I think, what was going to be mentioned by the speaker on the opening bench, on how in 2008 they recovered without the need to do this kind of suspension of these labor rights. And so on our side, it actually provides this possibility to actually remove this crisis from happening, to actually go back to the state of how we actually function as in the economy without the need to actually reduce their rights as workers. And so their side means making social capital less prioritized and thus not incentivizing economic stability as to how the people are the economy in this day and age people. Labeling the unions as selfish is a clear show of reducing such capital for the financial capital, and thus companies will have this leeway to actually exploit the people on their side, and how morally I would like to state that people should not be treated as the ends or not as, and in fact not as instruments, because it is not a debatable trade-off. We should not trade off their rights as workers for such a situation. In fact, our side allows for the flexibility that I have stated, because a case of such has happened in COVID-19, wherein companies had to adhere to laws and trade unions without the need to actually remove their rights as people. And so this would allow for flexibility while not giving the negatives that have been on their side. And so I would like to give some positive extensions and actually refute more, considering that on the topic of how workers' rights are actually economic shock absorbers, considering that labor protections and unions act as shock absorbers. And so overall, if you would like to not end up in an outcome where the silencing of the civil rights movement, the collapse of Wall Street and apartheid is perpetuated, side on the team opposition. Thank you.